Good evening. Welcome to part 7 of Bedtime Stories. It was high noon. The slaves were still working the field when word of Mike Tolliver's murder got out. The news was passed along row upon row of sugar cane on the wings of heated whispers. They collectively ceased work altogether when Josiah, one of the more popular gang leaders, confirmed that it was true. Flossie froze, allowing Josiah's words to wash over her like acid rain. Mr. Mike dead? That can't be possible. Ajuma promised me he wouldn't touch him. Oh my God, Ajuma, no, she thought in despair. There was one thing Flossie knew for certain. White folks don't sit by quietly when one of them turns up dead, low class or not. There would be ramifications for Mr. Mike's murder. The air around her felt like a powder keg about to blow. She needed to get away from Magnolia Hill tonight, if not sooner. At day's end, Flossie rushed to the river to hide several items she intended to take with her later on that night. Her stash was piteously meager. Upon her return to her cabin, she went through the motions of picking greens from the little garden outside to prepare dinner for her and little Jake. Soon the funky smell of collards and fatback boiling in a big metal pot over the fireplace filled the cabin. She kept telling herself, "This will be the last meal I cook in this hellhole." But even as the thought and the words passed her lips, she really didn't believe it. Nothing good ever happened in her life. That is, nothing except Ajuma and little Jake. Her mama's name was Sorrow. Flossie's name should have been Misery, because all her life she'd been beaten down with it, so much so that she couldn't conceive of anything else. Instead of feeling excitement that Ajuma would soon be taking her and little Jake away from Magnolia Hill, she felt heavy in heart and spirit. Something bad is going to happen. I smell it in the air, she thought, before drifting off into a troubled sleep. Nearly all the planters on River Road wore fashionable, low-heeled, square-toed shoes with buckles on them, but not Claude Etienne. He wore custom-made Hessian boots with silver-tipped tassels and riding spurs that sliced like razors into the flesh of any horse he rode. The tassels made a tinkling sound with every step he took, similar to wind chimes. There wasn't a slave on Magnolia Hill who did not fear Claude's familiar footfall. He was like a bad storm, always leaving death and destruction in his wake. Flossie was abruptly wrenched from a sound sleep by the tinkling sound of those dreaded boots 1 second before her cabin door was kicked in, leaving pieces of splintered wood everywhere. And now Claude was standing in the opening where the flimsy cabin door had once hung, flanked by 3 other planters. Together they blocked the light of the setting sun and sucked every ounce of air out of the cabin. Claude's slate-gray eyes were as cold and unyielding as the metal surrounding his pointed-toed boots where Flossie now focused her attention. She knew this showdown was a long time coming. Flossie stood in the middle of the cabin with her arms wrapped around little Jake, frozen with fear. She immediately transferred that fear to the 2-year-old, who clutched her skirts and began to whimper. "I want to know who made that little yellow nigger you're holding, and who put that other sucker in your belly," Claude said, cutting to the chase. He'd done a thorough investigation since Tolliver's body was found. A slave named Minnie reported hearing a man's raised voice coming from Flossie's cabin the night before. Flossie gulped so loud it sounded like a gunshot in the cabin. "Where is he, wench?" Claude demanded. Flossie was smart enough not to ask who the he was. And even if she wanted to, she couldn't. She could only open and shut her mouth like a fish out of water. Each time she made an attempt to answer, she just couldn't force any sound out. Fear had a stranglehold on her throat and had snatched her ability to speak. In a voice as smooth as silk, Claude said, "I'm going to ask you one more time where that buck of yourn is, wench." and I want the answer, the right one." Then he focused his gaze on her crying son. "And you better shut that squalling pickaninny up before I have old Nestor here do it for you," he threatened. Nestor French stood by like a hungry wolf, his wicked yellow tooth grin striking an even deeper chord of fear in Flossie and her son. Nestor had a reputation for performing unnatural acts with little boys. "I got something to stuff his mouth with right here," he said, fisting his groin and licking his thin lips. French looked like he was itching to harm little Jake, who was at that point crying his little heart out. Flossie quickly clamped her hand over her son's mouth. She did it so hard that all you could hear was muffled sounds of aborted whimpers trapped deep in his little throat. Claude was waiting for a response. The look in his eyes let Flossie know he didn't plan to wait too much longer. Flossie's mind was racing. She had to think fast. Obviously, someone had either seen or heard Ajuma in her cabin. Her throat felt like sandpaper. She cleared her throat and tried to swallow, but there was no spit left in her mouth to moisten her throat and no way out of this dire situation. "Ajuma, please help me," she thought frantically. "I don't know what to do. I don't know what to say." "Master Claude," she said hesitantly, automatically reverting to what is commonly known amongst the slaves as nigger speak. "I'm sorry, massa, real sorry, but I don't know what you're talking about," she continued in a tremulous voice. "There was a man in my cabin last night, but I don't know his name. He must be one of those maroons, massa. He sometime come into my cabin at night and have his way with me. I swear for Almighty God I ain't seen him since we laid down to sleep last night. When I woke this morning, he was gone, massa, and that be the truth," she said, holding her breath. Claude addressed his companions. "Well, Nestor, George, Parker," he said, deferring to each man in turn with a questioning look on his face. "This here nigger wench says she telling me the whole truth. So I guess that's what it is, just because she said so, right?" George Ravenel responded to Claude without taking his rapacious eyes off Flossie. "Personally, Claude, I don't believe a word that just came out of her mouth," he said, flicking out a pocket knife to negligently clean beneath his fingernails. Ravenel then turned to the other two men. "How about you, Parker, Nestor? You believe her?" he asked. Both Parker Villarreal and Nestor French responded in the negative, as Flossie knew they would. After all, this was a game of cat and mouse. Flossie knew which role she played. She silently prayed they would not hurt Jacob or her unborn baby. Claude stepped within an inch of Flossie. She could smell the liquor on his breath and the stench that comes out of white men's pores just before they get ready to do something really evil. She had never been so afraid in her entire life. "Well, it looks to me like we got us a consensus," he said. "Do you know what the word consensus means, gal?" Claude asked. Flossie was not expected to answer her question. His question showed she did. "It means that nobody believes your lying black ass," he spat. And with that, Claude took off his thick leather belt with a big silver buckle and struck Flossie a vicious blow across her face. The buckle connected with her mouth, busting her lips open and knocking out all of her front teeth. Flossie hunched her body in a vain attempt to shield Jacob and her belly from harm. The second or third blow, she knew not which, hit Flossie in her right eye, literally pulling it out of the socket. Everything happened in slow motion after that. Claude swung his belt with vicious intent, utterly destroying her beautiful face, while French, Villarreal, and Ravenel moved in like sharks smelling blood in the water. The last thing Flossie remembered was Parker Villarreal kicking her in the stomach so hard that both she and little Jacob went flying across the cabin. And then there was merciful darkness. Flossie came to with a mouth full of blood, nearly choking on the thick, metallic substance. She spit the blood out, experimentally running her tongue over pieces of jagged, broken teeth. There was an empty space where her front teeth and two side teeth used to be. She was still on the floor where they left her, battered, beaten, and bloody. She whimpered like a wounded animal when her brain sent out the signal for her body to try to move. She slowly lifted her head, and agony pulsated through every inch of her body. She hurt all over, but nothing compared to the pain in her right eye. It felt like someone was shoving a fireplace poker in the socket and cruelly twisting it. Her cotton skirt was spattered with blood and rushed around her waist. Her blouse pulled up, exposing her swollen breast and pregnant belly. Pieces of bone were protruding from the side of her calf. What she couldn't see were the human bite marks on her breast, her neck, and her thighs. There was blood and crusty dried semen around that place between her thighs and buttocks that screamed with pain from the inside out. She barely had enough strength with which to cover herself. It took every bit of power she possessed to move her head to take in the rest of the cabin. When Flossie looked over and saw little Jacob's lifeless body, a moan rose up from the soles of her feet, gaining power as it traveled through her body and up to her mouth, exiting in what would later be described throughout the slave quarters as a scream from the graves of all their murdered ancestors. Thank you. Good night.